National Nancy's, the fourth in the Alex Reynolds Mysteries. Author Fred Hunter, St. Martin's Press, New York, 2000. Narrator Eric Aust. Chapter 3. When I awoke on Saturday morning, Peter's arms were wrapped around me. I was still experiencing enough of an afterglow that, for a time, I was blissfully unaware of the troubles or depression I'd been feeling in recent days. I gently dislodged myself from his embrace, propped myself on one elbow, and watched him sleep. There's a dreamy sensuality about him when he's asleep. His hair was tousled attractively, and one wrist was drawn across his forehead, so that he looked like one of those underwear ads with perfect models sprawled out on rocks by the ocean. I gently stroked the hair that trails down from his chest to his stomach. There was movement beneath his eyelids, and a lazy smile spread across his face before he opened his eyes. "Good morning," I said. "Good morning. What time is it?" "A little after 8, he groaned. "Let me go back to sleep." "Not a chance. We've got work to do." "I'm off today." I smiled and shook my head. "From Florida Huts, maybe, but not from the Charlie Clark campaign." He groaned more loudly and turned over on his side. "I just want to sleep." "Should I remind you about how important it is to get involved? Or that Charlie Clark is a vital candidate and the best thing to happen to the gay community since the puppy episode?" He craned his head around and squinted at me over his shoulders. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" "Ho ho, you bet I am." I gave his naked butt a slap, and he grabbed my arm and pulled me down to him. When we came into the kitchen, Mother was making breakfast and softly singing. "I could have danced all night. I know I'm in trouble when she reverts to Lerner and Lowe." She was happy, too happy, in a Raymond Chandler wives eyeing their husbands' necks kind of way. She didn't offer any explanation, and I didn't ask, since I figured anything she said would make me want to lock her in her room. Duffy sat in the corner next to his doggy bed rather than in it, staring up at her. For once, his expression was quizzical, without being adoring. There isn't a dog on earth that can look as thoroughly confused as a Westie. He blinked occasionally, as if he were beginning to wonder whether or not his mistress had slipped a biscuit. We carried on with a superficial conversation during breakfast, while Mother maintained that irritating glow. When I worked up the courage to ask how her date had gone, she looked across the table at me with insufferable innocence and said, "I enjoyed the movie." I didn't even want to begin to think what she meant by that. Peter and I arrived at campaign headquarters at about 9:30 and set to work at the endless envelope stuffing. There were a lot more volunteers than usual, probably because it was the weekend and more were available, but despite the general good humor, the mood was somewhat subdued. Details of the personal threat made to Jody had leaked out, and the rat was common knowledge. Those who hadn't been there to witness the event had certainly been told about it. There was a tentativeness about the way everyone was working, as if we were all wondering from which can of peanut brittle the next coil of snake would leap. Everyone bridled when the mail carrier brought in his delivery. Jody emerged from her cubicle for the first time that morning and ordered him to deposit it in her space, rather than Mary's, adding that that would be the procedure from then on. She seemed angrier than she had the day before. There would be no repeat of the former incident. Clark came into the office at about 11 o'clock, this time without the entourage. He was wearing crispy pressed chinos and a plaid shirt, and Peter rolled his eyes at my whispered suggestion that the look would be more effective if it wasn't quite so obviously man of the people. He passed through the workers, creating the usual buzz, but only tossing a couple of mild hellos at us before disappearing into the back. "What was that thing attached to his hip?" Peter asked. "What?" "Oh, that was John Schuler, his campaign manager." He sticks any more closely to Clark's back, and those gay rumors are going to get worse." I smiled. "What?" Nothing. It's just for a few days there. I thought I'd lost you. It's nice to have you back. He handed me an envelope. Stuff it, honey. Not long after the candidate arrived, Jody knocked on the door of the back room and was promptly admitted. She was gone for quite a while, and during that interval I glanced over at the phones a couple of times and caught Sean Stillman watching the door while answering his calls. He seemed inordinately interested in Jody's absence. You would have thought she was a teacher, seeing the high school principal about his low test scores. When she finally re-emerged, Sean quickly looked away and acted as if he'd never been distracted from his work. Jody then did her usual swing through the room to see that all the volunteers were keeping busy. That was a long meeting, I said when she stopped by her table. Huh? She replied absently as she scanned the piles of flyers. With Clark. I wasn't with Clark. I was with Schuler. I was genuinely surprised by her tone. Is everything all right? Of course it is, she snapped. He just wanted to know about all the crap that's been happening, and he told me he appreciates everything we're putting up with. I mean, everything we're doing. She stumbled slightly on the word appreciates, which made me wonder if he had appreciated it quite as much as she thought he should. You sound like you don't like him. Schuler? He doesn't know what he's doing. He was an accountant, for Christ's sakes. What does he know about running a campaign? Then how did he get the job? She snorted disdainfully. He's had his nose up Clark's ass for years. They've been friends since college. Schuler's one of those guys who hangs on to people just in case they might get somewhere sometime. He lucked out with Charlie. I shrugged. It sounds to me like Clark's a good friend. Charlie's a great candidate, but he's a soft touch. That's going to cost him someday. Schuler's not qualified for that job. He's just not. Well, just as a point of interest, I said with an alarming lack of caution. How exactly are you qualified to be office manager of a political campaign? Jody turned deep red. I have passion for something other than myself. She went back to her cubicle without another word. Clark and Schuler left about an hour later. I laughed when the door closed after them. Peter was right. Schuler kept so close at Clark's heels that he was giving new meaning to the phrase dogging his tail. The low point of the day came just after noon when Mother arrived unexpectedly with Simon Tavalli in tow. What are you doing here? I asked as nicely as I could. I'm showing Simon around, Mother said. I turned to him. Aren't you supposed to be at a seminar? Oh, I'm fluffing off today, he replied cheerily. I suppose I could be sitting in a stuffy room listening to stuffy lectures, but I'm having much too much fun with your mother. I waited a beat, then said, There's got to be a better way of putting that. I told Simon where you were working, said Mother, and he wanted to see it. I've never seen a campaign headquarters before. I thought it would be exciting. Well, here it is, I said with a shrug. Simon's eyes traveled around the dingy, cramped, unkept storefront. And exactly the Ritz, is it? He said. It serves its purpose, I replied crisply. Peter surreptitiously gave my butt a sharp pinch. I winced, but managed not to cry out. Is there a loo? In the back. He left us, and I wheeled around to Peter. What was that for? Are you aware that everything you say to that man sounds like a challenge? What? I didn't mean it that way. I looked at Mother, who had folded her arms and was eyeing me with a peculiar smile on her face. I didn't. She reached out and placed her hand on my cheek. Alex, you are a darling. She gave me a peck on the forehead. I felt not unlike a puppy who had just found himself mysteriously dropped in the middle of a lake and had no idea in which direction the shore was. When Simon rejoined us, he said, Well, Jean, let's be off. He looked at me. I'm taking your mom to lunch, and then she's taking me to the Art Institute, Mother offered. Oh, yes, I understand. The collection is amazing. Loves, Mother said as Simon slipped an arm around her waist and ushered her out of the building. I looked at Peter. Loves. She's getting more British by the minute. Peter smiled. And you're getting more darling. We had another motherless evening, and although Peter had been able to distract me the night before by offering himself as a willing sacrifice on the altar of our mutual sex drives, he wasn't as successful that night. After several attempts to engage me in conversation while we watched television, he ended up spending the evening doing crossword puzzles while I sat with my face pointing at the TV set. Truth to tell, I don't know that I could have explained what there was about Simon Tivoli that bothered me, other than the obvious. Part of it was that he seemed too slick for his own good. I don't know what he was like while he was out with my mother, but during the brief times I'd spent with him, he registered as an overly pleasant facade. I came away from these encounters feeling that I knew less about him than before. Not that anything but light pleasantries had passed between us. In my saner moments, I reminded myself that Peter was right. Mother was a good judge of character. Of course, my next thought was always that didn't mean she couldn't be blinded by a pretty face, and Tivoli's was nothing if not pretty. I tried to chalk these feelings up to the general malaise I was going through. Television that night was dominated by news on the upcoming primary. Try as I might, flipping endlessly from station to station, all I could find were reports on the candidates. And if it wasn't reports, it was a deluge of commercials, each more negative than the last, except for Clark's. His commercials focused on his successful law practice and all of the good he'd done in the course of his private career. His opponents' commercials were another story. Clark was roundly vilified by the Republican Party and the religious right, two groups that had long since become synonymous with each other in my mind. Clark met all accusations and recriminations, no matter how outrageous, with an almost superhuman grace that even his opponents had to find admirable, if not frustrating. By the time we went to bed, I had sunk so far back into the blue haze I'd been experiencing of late that I didn't even wonder what Mother was doing. I woke up suddenly in the pitch darkness, feeling like I hadn't slept at all. The luminous red numbers on our clock read 5:07. I groaned inwardly at the thought that I might have reached the insomnia stage of depression. Then I realized that I'd been awakened by noise. A steady stream of screeching sirens was rapidly headed our way. I tensed as they neared our house, then breathed a guilty sigh of relief when they passed us by and faded a bit. Peter hadn't stirred during the commotion. He was lying on his side, his breathing slow and steady. He emitted a light whistle on every third exhale. I wrapped my arms around him and tried to go back to sleep. But it was difficult. I just couldn't seem to keep my brain from running through my shortcomings. After a while, that song from Oliver, reviewing the situation, crossed my mind, at which point all hope of further sleep was lost. The lyrics went through my head with maddening precision, and when I finally came to the end of the song's many verses, I would begin to feel a sense of relief, only to have the whole song start over again. I'm not sure what time it was when I'd finally exhausted myself and started to doze off, but I was roused almost immediately by the phone. I fumbled for the extension on our bedside table and pressed the receiver to my ear, barely managing to mumble a groggy, "Hello? Alex, are you awake?" "Mm-hmm." There was a pause. "Are you sure?" "Sure, I'm sure," I breathed. "Who is this?" "It's Sheila. Did you hear what happened?" "Did you hear what happened?" she asked more insistently. "What?" "Clark's campaign headquarters. They blew it up." "That's nice," I sighed, but I could feel my face creasing with confusion. My eyes popped open. "What?" "Charlie Clark's campaign headquarters. There was an explosion there." "You're kidding." Peter said, rolling over and looking at me. I motioned him to wait. "How did it happen?" "I don't know yet," said Sheila. "The police or the fire department. I don't know which. They called Clark right after it happened, and one of Clark's aides called Annie Watson and asked her to notify all the volunteers to let them know not to go there. She called me, and I said I'd call you." "They notified Annie? Why didn't they called Jody? I don't know. I didn't ask. I was too stunned by the news to think. You live right by there, though. Didn't you hear anything? I had this weird sensation that I was dreaming. I put my hand on my forehead, and the minute flesh touched flesh, I realized I was really awake. Yeah, I did. A couple of hours ago, I heard sirens. That was probably it, said Sheila. Was it a bomb? I don't know. I don't think anyone does yet. Anyway, I need to let you know. Headquarters is closed for the time being. I guess someone will call you when we're set up again. By the time I hung up, Peter was wide awake. He'd been snapped into consciousness by the tone of the conversation. I told him what had happened. Jesus, he said. I jumped out of bed. Let's get dressed. I want to go over there. You're kidding. Oh, don't play the voice of reason with me now. The place we were working yesterday just blew up. Are you going to tell me you don't want to see it? He pursed his lips, then tossed back the covers and climbed out of bed. Apparently, some of the familial thrill-seeking shared by Mother and me was beginning to rub off on him. Either that or he was too tired to mount any serious objection. We threw on some clothes and raced out of the house, but not so fast that I didn't notice that not a creature was stirring, not even my mother. The office was a few blocks away, but we could smell burned wood and ash before we'd gone very far. When we rounded the corner onto Lincoln Avenue, we found the street blocked off at both ends by squad cars. A fire engine was parked in the middle of the street, just north of our former office, and several unmarked cars were spaced around it. I was surprised to see that Mary Lynn Hayden was seated in the open door of one of those vehicles. She was staring distraught and saucer-eyed at the wreckage. There was no sign of Jody. There was a gaping hole where headquarters used to be. The blast had swept outward, taking out half the mini-mart on the left and the entire empty storefront on the right. It had been about 2 hours since the explosion, but there was still a lot of activity. A crew from the fire department was hosing down the neighboring buildings, the remains of which were still smoldering. There were a few men gingerly poking their way through the charred remains of the office, and several others standing in the street, watching their progress. On the opposite side of the street, 3 separate news crews were jockeying for position, in which their field reports could get the most dramatic backdrop to use in telling their stories. I imagined that more would be coming. Frank O'Neill was leaning against one of the unmarked cars. Frank was a commander at Area 3 headquarters and, coincidentally, had dated Mother for a while after they met while taking a night course in English literature at DePaul. You have to love a literate cop. Mother had long since decided that she and Frank weren't meant to be as far as romance went, but in a typical show of British loyalty, insisted on maintaining a friendship with him, which only succeeded in keeping his little torch alive. But that came in useful to us now and then. Peter and I stood with the small crowd by the blue police line, sawhorses, and I waved to Frank to try to get his attention. He looked less surprised to see us than I would have liked. In fact, as he came over to us, he looked as if our appearance on the scene meant more trouble than he already had. I don't suppose you guys just came to gawk, he said. As a matter of fact, we've been working here, I replied, jutting my thumb at the hole where the office had been. We've been volunteering for the Clark campaign. Frank sighed. It figures. I couldn't tell if he was referring to the fact that Clark was known to have a gay following, or because in the past we'd been known to be involved in some ridiculously awkward situations. Either way, I didn't like the way he said it. He pushed aside the sawhorse and admitted us as he added, If you were working there, we'd better talk. Who are all these people? Peter asked as we followed Frank back to where he'd been standing. Well, the guys with the hoses are from the fire department. Very funny, I said. The guys going through the rubble are from the bomb and arson squad. So you think it was a bomb, said Peter. And those guys over there, Frank said, ignoring the question and gesturing toward 2 men standing on the periphery of the activity. I think you know. Why would we? I started, but stopped when I recognized one of the men. Oh, the one on the left is Will Henry, the guy from the FBI. Uh-huh. Frank folded his arms across his chest and stared at me. Wait a minute, we're not working with those guys. But you know them by name. I know the one on the left because he's been in the office before. Uh-huh. Really? We've been getting a lot of threats, and he's the one they were turned over to. There was a pause during which Frank didn't flinch. In fact, I wasn't quite sure he was still breathing. I'm telling you the truth, Frank. We are not working with those people. He continued his silence just long enough to let me know he was finding me very hard to believe, which I would have found truly offensive were it not for the fact that we'd had to lie to him so often. Then he showed signs of relenting. He turned to Peter. To answer your question, yes, it looks like it was a bomb. God! I'm surprised Jody isn't here, I said. You mean Jody Lynn Hayden? Frank asked. Yeah, she's Clark's most rabid supporter and our office manager. Her partner's over there, but I don't see Jody. Frank cleared his throat. Yeah, well, she may be here. Huh? Her partner showed up here an hour ago after getting the call about what happened. She flew over here. Said when she got up this morning, Jody was nowhere to be found. You mean she might... Oh, God! Frank nodded. We watched the men from the bomb and arson squad for a while as they continued to survey the wreckage. Then one of them stepped his way carefully through it and headed toward us. Commander, he said to Frank, hate to make your life more miserable, but there's no doubt about it. There was somebody in there when she blew. Frank swore and gave a kick at a small stone that had been lying at his feet. My eye was caught by movement far to the right. Mary Lynn Hayden emerged from the car and was headed toward us like a woman in a trance. Her pace quickened as she neared until she was almost running. What? What did he say? What is it? She demanded. Frank looked at her and said with a kindness that made me proud of him. He said there was someone inside when the building went. Mary stared at him blankly for a moment. Then her breathing began to speed up and deepen. Miss Lynn Hayden, that doesn't mean it was your friend. It could be anyone. It might even have been... Mary didn't hear him. She stared wild-eyed at the remains of the building and screamed. Jody! Jody! She screamed toward the ashes, but Frank and the other guy caught her by the arms and held her fast. She continued to scream and struggled to free herself. For a few moments before collapsing, the guy from bomb and arson picked her up and carried her back to the car in which she'd been sitting. He tried to be careful, but once he had placed her on the seat in a sitting position, she flopped backward like a rag doll. Frank, Peter, and I had been watching this, so none of us noticed the approach of Will Henry, the FBI agent. Excuse me, he directed himself to Peter and me. What are you doing here? Why are you in the Corden area? Frank answered for us. Agent Henry, this is Alex Reynolds and Peter Livesey. They've been volunteering in the office. I know who they are, Henry replied tersely. Frank looked at me as if he thought this was proof that I'd been lying to him again. I said, they must know everybody who's been working for the campaign. Henry continued. My question was, what are you doing here? Weren't all of the volunteers called and asked not to come here? I verbally shuffled my feet. Yeah, but this is a restricted area. I'll have to ask you to leave. Well, all right, but now, please. Apparently, Henry's tone was harsh enough that Frank realized we weren't working with him. He said, I thought since they worked here, they might be able to help us out with some information. Without looking at him, Henry said, we'll be interviewing everyone connected with this office later at their homes. Now, please. I caught myself just short of saying, do you know who we are? Which would have sounded hopelessly melodramatic and would have been unwise given the fact that we weren't supposed to tell anyone that we did occasionally work for the CIA. Come on, Alex, said Peter. As he led me away, I heard Henry say, Commander, I'd like to have a word with you. Mother was up and about when we returned home. We went into the kitchen and found her in her white satin kimono. The one I like the least, because it makes her look like an angel in a cheesy Christmas pageant, sitting at the table and sipping a cup of tea. "Good heavens," she exclaimed when she saw us. "You're up and about early. I didn't know you'd gone out." "Didn't you hear us? I heard a bit of a ruckus, but I didn't realize you'd gone. Would you like some breakfast?" We both declined, opting for tea. While I fixed it, Peter explained to Mother what had happened. "Good Lord! And there was FBI agents there," I added indignantly. "And one of them fairly threw us off the street. He wouldn't listen to a word. He just insisted that we leave." Mother set her mug down on the table. There was a sly smile on her face and a glimmer in her eye. "There were federal agents there." "What's so funny about that?" "Nothing, darling. It's just that I'm surprised you made it home before they did." "What do you mean by that?" "Well, normally when you involve us in your little peccadillos, I end up entertaining government agents, a devilishly hard thing to do, by the way, since they simply refuse to be entertained, while waiting for you to show up to explain yourself." "That's not fair," I whined. She raised a palm, signaling me to stop. "Think before you speak, my love." She really wasn't being fair, but I did as she said because I have a very hard record to argue in favor of, but I wasn't prepared to let it slide entirely. "You can't believe that that building was blown up just because of my presence?" "Of course not, dear." Her expression had melted from amusement to concern. It threw me a bit off balance, and I thought it best to get back to the matter at hand. "The FBI will be by later, though. At least, I think they will. The agent that threw us out said they were going to question everybody connected with Clark's headquarters." Mother pushed back her hair. "Oh, I'd better get dressed then." "They're not coming to question you," I said, "and we have no idea when they'll be here." "I still can't let them into the house in nothing but a kimono." "What would the neighbors think?" She left the room, and Peter and I fell silent. Finally, Peter said, "Is something bothering you?" I looked up, startled out of my reverie, and realized that for several minutes I'd been staring pensively down into my mug as I stirred the tea. Well, yeah, I was just thinking, if it really was Jody who was in the building when it blew up, then this bombing might not exactly be political." "How do you mean?" "I told you about the threat she got at home, the obscene phone call, and the rat." When I mentioned this, Peter shuddered slightly. "I mean, the envelope it came in was addressed to the office, but whoever sent it must have known that Charles Clark doesn't open the mail there." "Yeah," Peter said slowly, "but it arrived the day he was going to be in the office." "Still, would anyone think a candidate would be opening the mail himself? The timing might have just been a coincidence." "Who usually does open the mail?" "Mary." "Well, if whoever sent the rat knew anything about the office, wouldn't they know that Jody wasn't the one who would get it?" "Maybe, but if they wanted to get to Jody, it was a good way to do it. Those two may have been an odd couple, but they were devoted to each other. Fiercely devoted. If you go by Jody, I think she was angrier about Mary being upset like that than she was about the threat to her own life." Peter set down her mug and eyed me with one raised eyebrow. "You realize you just spoke of Jody in the past tense. It could have been anyone in that office when the bomb went off." I shook my head. "Who else would have been there at 5 a.m? It was another 2 hours before the Fed showed up at our door. When the bell rang, Mother came down the stairs wearing something that looked like a peasant dress tied with a thin brown belt just beneath her ample breasts. She flung open the door and took one look at the pair of blue-suited men on the top step and exclaimed, "You must be the agents. Do come in." "Dear God," I whimpered to Peter. "She's gone from Eliza Doolittle to Annie Main." He poked me in the side as the men came into the living room. Mother closed the door behind them. "I'm Agent Henry," said the one I already knew, "and this is my partner, Agent Raymond." Mother shook his hand, a puzzled look on her face. Are those your first names? No, Henry replied with a smile that I found uncharacteristic in a G-man. I'm Will Henry, and this is Philip Raymond. Willie and Phil, I blurted out. Mother and Peter both looked at me as if they couldn't take me anywhere, including our own living room. Henry's smile disappeared. We'd like to talk to you about what happened. Have a seat, said Mother, motioning them to the couch. The three of us pulled up chairs and sat facing them. First, said Henry, let me tell you that we know who you are. Well, we figured that, I said. No, I mean we know what you are. Mother's face hardened on Peter's and my behalf. I beg your pardon. My partner is putting this badly, Raymond cut in. What he's trying to say is that we know you work for the government. I should say that you have worked for us. I believe you report to an Agent Lawrence Nelson. How do you know that? Asked Peter, who was always inclined to be a bit more suspicious than I am. Raymond explained. When it became apparent that Charles Clark was a serious candidate for senator, and when the threats began, we did background checks on all the people who were working for him. The paid staffers and the regular volunteers, both in the Springfield office and here. Of course, there are a lot of other volunteers in and out of there, just in for a couple of days and then gone. We really couldn't keep track of all of them, but the ones that are considered regulars we did check on. The two of you qualify in that category. If you knew we were connected with the government, I said, then why did you run us off this morning? We didn't want anyone to think you were working with us, Henry replied. I understand from Nelson that your participation in government activities is strictly on a covert basis. Covert, I said with a glance at Peter. It sounded so underhanded when he put it like that. So you've talked to Nelson, said Peter. He sounded as if he was liking this less and less. Of course, said Henry, and he assured us of your cooperation. What's all this in aid of? Said Mother. Raymond sighed. Well, it's now obvious that the threats that have been made against Clark and his campaign are quite serious. Didn't you always take them seriously? Said Peter. Of course. However, people who phone in bomb threats don't usually carry them out. Now, that this one has, Harry chimed in, security around Clark is going to have to be increased, and our investigation into the bomb threats will have to be intensified. As well as your investigation into the death that occurred this morning, said Peter. His voice was beginning to take on his soapbox tone, and with good reason. We'd seen before the lack of enthusiasm with which various authorities pursued the murder of gays, and how, where the feds are concerned, murder could take a backseat to political expediency. The office that had been destroyed may have been Charlie Clark's headquarters, but the only person killed had been a dyke. Peter and I were both jaded enough to believe the feds might not take Jody's death as seriously as we would like. Of course, Henry replied tersely. Peter's tone hadn't been lost on him. Do you know for sure whether or not it really was Jody Lynn Hayden who was inside when the office blew up? Mother asked. No, there is unfortunately not a lot left from which to do an identification. Forensics has a lot of work to do before we know anything, and even when they're done, we may not know definitely. We are going to proceed on the assumption that was Mrs. Lynn Hayden. Why? I asked. I mean, if you don't know, why would you assume it was her? Partly because her partner is so sure it was. I had to give Henry one thing. He didn't flinch when referring to the relationship between Jody and Mary, as we'd seen some feds and police do in the past. He continued, Mary Lynn Hayden seems convinced that it was Jody who was in the office. Do you have any reason to believe it could have been someone else? I shook my head. No. I can't imagine anyone else going there that early, and it would be like Jody. Has she done that before? Not that I know of, but the thing is, it wouldn't have surprised me to find out she was getting there at 5 in the morning. It wouldn't have surprised me to find out she was living there. Didn't Mary know why Jody was there? She claims she doesn't. I replied, trying not to sound as surprised as I felt. Now, said Henry, sitting up a bit straighter, here's one area where you can help us. As you saw this morning, The office was completely destroyed. We have no way of knowing if somebody broke in to plant the bomb or if it was planted by someone who was in the office while it was open. Can you tell us if there was anybody unusual there in, say, the past day or so? Oh, God, I said, rolling my eyes. It has to be the past 2 days. What's wrong with that? Raymond asked. Just that absolutely everybody has been in the office in the past 2 days. The day before yesterday, Clark himself was there along with John Schuler, his campaign manager. There were a dozen of reporters and there were volunteers I'd never seen before who came in to get a look at Clark. Would any of them have had a chance to, say, place a package under one of the tables? They could have bred livestock under the tables without anyone noticing. The place was jammed with people. Henry cleared his throat. Yes, well, what about yesterday? There were fewer people, Peter added, but we were kept pretty busy, so somebody could have planted a package without us noticing. Do you know that was where the bomb was? Under a table? Raymond shook his head. We don't know that for sure. The center of the blast seems to have been pretty far back. It might have been in the back room. Did you see anyone go into the back room? Anyone who didn't belong there? The bathroom was in the back room, I explained. Everyone went back there at one time or another. And Clark and Schuler's office was back there. They were in again yesterday. Anyone else unusual? Henry asked. I thought for a moment, then suddenly had a sickening thought. Mother and her new beau had been in the office yesterday, and Simon had gone into the back room. Not that I can recall, I said, feeling uncomfortably, like Ronald Reagan, or at least how I thought he should have felt. The agents both stared at me as if they could see right through me. I turned to Mother. Not only did she not look exactly forthcoming, she looked as if she had no idea what was up with me. So I looked at Peter and said, Can you think of anyone? No, he replied simply. All right, Henry said dutifully, turning back to me. We understand that there was a blow-up. Excuse me, bad choice of words. That there was some kind of argument between Jody Lynn Hayden and one of the volunteers, a David Leach. Dave? I said. She yelled at him for laughing, that's all. We were told that he left right after this happened. That's true. Do you know if he came back at all? No, I said, wrinkling my nose. You don't think Dave did this? She fought with him, Henry said. She embarrassed him, for Christ's sake. You don't kill somebody just because they embarrass you. Murders have been committed for less than that, said Raymond without emotion. You don't know Dave. I can imagine him throwing a hissy fit, but a bomb? Hell, Jody yelled at me too. Are you going to suspect me of bombing the place because I might have been embarrassed? The two of them stared back at me with a complete lack of expression. My stomach dropped as I realized that was exactly what they would do. Peter rescued the moment. So you guys think maybe Jody was the actual target of the bomb? Henry nodded. She was the only one caught up by it. We have to consider that possibility. Yes, especially in light of the fact that she had recently received some personal threats. Raymond added, This is a matter of being thorough. She may have been the target, or Clark may have been, or just the office. Right now, there's too many possibilities. How could Mr. Clark have been the target? Mother asked. The bomb went off at 5 in the morning. That's just it, said Henry. We don't know anything yet. It went off at 5, but that could have been a mistake. It could have been meant to go off later, or earlier. You mean, when we were there? I exclaimed. Uh-huh. But more to the point, when Clark was there. Excuse us, if that's not the point to us, said Peter. Henry smiled sheepishly. I was only talking in terms of motive. So you have absolutely no idea who planted the bomb or why, said Mother. Always wanted to bring us back to the matter at hand. Raymond took a deep breath. Well, most likely it's the simplest explanation. Someone, a terrorist of some sort, planned to blow up the office when nobody was there as a scare tactic, and it was only a fluke that Miss Lynn Hayden happened to be in the office at the time. Her presence was a shame because it really complicates matters, Mother replied in her haughtiest Masterpiece Theater accent. Her presence was a shame because she's dead. I was surprised she beat Peter to that one. Raymond managed to look abashed. Point well taken, Miss Reynolds. He paused and cleared his throat. As I said, we have to explore all avenues, and that's one of the reasons we decided to talk to you first. First, I said. Well, second, we did question Mary Lynn Hayden, but we want to enlist your aid in exploring one of those avenues. Really? I replied, perking up. What would that be? Henry said. It's possible that the bomb was planted by someone within Clark's organization. One of the staffers or one of the volunteers. You're kidding, said Peter. He shook his head. Clark is very popular in the polls, but he's also pissed off a lot of people and a lot of groups. You mean religious groups? I asked. Yes, religious groups and militias. Militias? Peter said, his tone becoming more disbelieving. Several militia groups have been really vocal about their hatred of Clark. We believe that some of the threats may have come from them. They've come very close to making threats publicly. But we also believe that some of the threats have come from the radical right, religious extremists. Those kinds of groups are very dangerous. Some of them disavow their place as American citizens. They feel they should be considered a different country. When you're that far outside the norms of society, there's no telling what you'll do. That's funny, Peter said through flat lips. I get the impression sometimes that the American government thinks that we belong in a different country. Henry looked at him as if he wasn't sure whether or not Peter was going to be more trouble than he was worth. And I wondered for a moment if he'd just throw up his hands and leave, but instead he went on as if Peter had said nothing. Those are just some of the possibilities. Someone from one of those groups may have infiltrated Clark's office for the express purpose of causing mischief. Mischief, I thought sardonically. Strange way to look at a bomb. Now, you guys have been working there. Is there anyone you think might not be what they seem? Peter and I glanced at each other. He looked as dumbfounded as I felt. I said, hey, you're asking if we think one of our co-workers might secretly be a member of a militia? Right. Or some other group. Most of the guys working in the office are gay. How in the hell would we tell them from someone in a militia? Check them for camouflage underwear? He shrugged. Maybe somebody is a little less enthusiastic about Clark than they should be? Or maybe a little too enthusiastic, overcompensating. There was something very McCarthy-esque about the tone in which he put this. I didn't like it at all. At that particular moment, I don't think I would have told him if one of my co-workers had been walking around with a ticking box. You want to know if there's anybody who is enthusiastic or isn't enthusiastic? Yes. No, I said, spreading my hands helplessly. Henry sighed heavily. Well, this brings us to the real point of our visit. We will, of course, be placing agents in Clark's Springfield office to keep tabs on what's going on down there, but we thought we'd enlist your aid in covering the Chicago office since, well, you've already infiltrated it. Infiltrated it? Peter said bristly. We've been doing mailings and answering phones, not photographing secret documents with a tiny tie clip camera. Henry stared at him a moment and then turned to me. Since you're already a part of Clark's campaign, what we'd like you to do is keep your eyes and ears open. See if you can ferret out any information on the people working for him. See if anybody there isn't what he or she seems to be. I smiled. So you want us to be undercover agents? Lawrence Nelson told us that you could be trusted, said Raymond. Paid agents, I said. There was a long pause before Henry replied. Of course. Now, it may be that this is a dead end. It probably is, but we need to cover everything. And as long as you're already there, and as you said, there are a lot of your people working in that office, we thought you might be the best ones to do it. Your people, said Peter, his voice hardening. You want us to spy on our own people? Yes, like the Mod Squad, I said. Mother could be Julie, and I suppose since you're already Peter, I have to be Link. I don't like the sound of this, Peter said, ignoring me. Henry replied, whoever planted the bomb just killed one of your people. Do you like the sound of that? Look, that's just the thing, said Mother. If someone in the office was the bomber, do you think they'd keep going there? Wouldn't they just disappear? No, Raymond answered, not necessarily. It would look too suspicious to disappear right now. And his work might not be over. Now, I really don't like the sound of that, said Mother. We'll do it, I announced quickly before she could complete her protest. Henry looked at me doubtfully, although he was the one who'd proposed this arrangement. He didn't seem any too pleased with my eagerness to comply. He turned to Mother and said, There shouldn't be any danger, Miss Reynolds. I can't tell you how little comfort that gives me. I also can't tell you how many times government agents have said the same thing to us in exactly the same situation. She paused for a breath and narrowed her eyes in my direction. Well, not exactly the same situation, but bloody near close to it, Raymond said. We're not asking them to track down the bomber and arrest him single-handedly. All we want them to do is talk to people, ask around a little bit, and see what they can see. He looked directly at me and added pointedly, If they find anything suspicious, they will report it back to us. Under no circumstances are they to confront anyone or try to apprehend anyone. They are just to report their findings. Is that clear? Are you talking to me? I said. Oh, he understands, Mother said, looking daggers at me. I'll see to it. She made it sound as if she was going to stand over me while I did my homework. Good, said Henry as he and his partner rose. They'll be reestablishing the office within the next couple of days, and you'll be called and given the location as soon as possible. He handed me a business card. Here's our numbers. When you have something to report, you can reach us there. You are to report only to me or Agent Raymond. Understood, I said. I took the card and stuffed it in my pocket. The three of us had risen, and the agent started for the door. Oh, just a minute, I said. They stopped and turned back to us with eerie symmetry. You said that Mary was the only one besides us that you questioned. Yes, Henry said. You haven't questioned David Leach yet. No, but we will. No, I said tartly. Oh, we will. I hardly think you're qualified. When it comes to questioning David Leach, I said, cutting him off, I hardly think you're qualified. You'll scare him to death. We can talk to him without doing that. There was a beat before Henry said, I thought you understood that your involvement in this was to be covert. I shrugged. So we'll do it covertly. Henry looked as if he was unsure whether or not our cooperation hinged on his agreeing to this. Finally he said, All right. I mean it, Henry, I said. You badger him and the deal's off. I said all right, he replied without emotion. They left and Mother closed the door before them. She then wheeled around and exclaimed, Are you out of your bloody mind? I don't want you working in an office that's been blown up. We'll be in a new one, Mother. You know what I mean, she said through clenched teeth. Why did you agree to this? Peter asked. I don't believe you, I said loudly. For weeks, the two of you have been telling me how important it is to do your civic duty, and the minute the government actually asks us for our help, you don't want to do it. Apparently, when you said your civic duty, you meant my civic duty, not your civic duty. Both Mother and Peter folded their arms across their respective chests and stared at me. What? Well, said Mother, that sounds very rational and patriotic of you, darling. But I have the feeling that deep down inside you're saying, Oh, goody, I get to play a spy again. That's not true, I exclaimed. A slight pause elapsed before I added, All right, it's partly true. But there's more to it than that. One of our very own people was killed, and I think we should participate in finding out who did it. Peter said, It's the emphasis on our people that bothers me. What do you mean? He sighed. An extremist group infiltrated that tiny office. I think Henry and Raymond have seen one too many Bruce Willis movies. Has it occurred to you that maybe the FBI wants our help because they think one of our people is the bomber? Actually, that hadn't occurred to me. Putting your paranoia aside for a minute, I retorted more angrily than I normally would with him. Do you think that means we shouldn't help catch him or her? He stared at me blankly for a second, then lowered his eyes. No, I don't. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to yell. He looked up. But that doesn't mean I would like finding out that we'd been used by the FBI or lied to. Agreed, I said. He smiled. I felt relieved and thanked the powers that be that Peter and I seldom experience a rift in our relationship. And when we do, it rarely lasts more than a few seconds. I hoped it would be the same with Mother, but I knew she really wasn't going to like what was coming next. Mother, darling, I said, lightly mocking her propensity for using the word. Before you start accusing me of getting involved in something dangerous again, may I ask you a question? Yes. I took a deep breath. How much do you know about Simon Tivoli? What? She exclaimed in her best Lady Bracknell. Simon, you've dated him, what, 3 or 4 days running? You spent a lot of time with him. How much do you know about him? I know you don't much care for Simon, she replied broadly. But have you completely gone around the bend? Mother, when those 2 agents asked if anyone out of the ordinary had come into the office in the past couple of days, I let my voice trail off and spread my palms. What? I didn't mention that you had been there with your friend. She looked puzzled for a moment, then said, Oh, yes, we were. Why didn't you mention it? Why didn't you? I didn't think of it. Why didn't you? Because I didn't want to get you involved. They're looking for a bomber. She curled her lips and said crisply, Well, it's nice to know you wouldn't shop your own mother. You know I'm talking about Simon. Look, he comes into your life out of the blue, and then the office blows up. It was a chance meeting, she said incredulously. From the expression on her face, it was clear she thought I really had lost my mind, and Mother's expressions were vivid enough that it was difficult to press on without doubting myself. Chance meetings can be arranged, I countered. He was in the office for no good reason the day before it blew up. He just wanted to see it, and he went to the bathroom. You could hardly have someone arrested for making water, she replied witheringly. Mother, I said with increasing exasperation, they believe the bomb was planted in the back room. We have someone here who's an almost complete stranger who wheedled his way into your life and came into that office for no real reason and was alone for a time in the back room. With a bomb concealed about his person, it's possible. Alex, she said patiently, what possible interest could Simon have in American politics? I had to think about that one. I don't know. Maybe it was something to do with trade. With England? Her voice slid up an octave on the last word. She was sounding more and more like Dame Edith Evans. It might not be his politics at all, I said irritably. He might have been paid to do it. She heaved a sigh. Do you think it possible that Simon may have had a real reason for coming to the office? Like what? Perhaps he didn't want to see the office at all. Perhaps he wanted to see you. Me? Why? Maybe he would like to get to know you better, she said simply. Why? Peter said, maybe because he thinks you don't like him. I could feel my face getting hot. Even if that were true, what the hell does it matter? He's going back to England in a week. I suddenly had that sinking feeling again. I turned to Mother and added, Isn't he? It was one of those rare moments of hesitation on her part. Well, as a matter of fact, he's been talking about extending his visit a bit. Why? Maybe he'd like to get to know me better. And if you say, why again, I'll send you to your room. I wasn't going to say that. And the fact that Simon is thinking of extending his visit rather puts a damper on your theory, doesn't it? If he was the bomber, he'd hardly be staying longer, would he now? Unless he's afraid leaving so soon would make him look suspicious. Like Agent Henry said. Oh, Tosh! Tosh! I exclaimed. Mother, whether you like it or not, Simon was in that office and in that back room, and that makes him a suspect. Now, either we can look into it, or those agents will. They're going to ask of the people who was in the office. Somebody's bound to remember Simon having been there. After a pause, she said wistfully, That's true. He is rather memorable. I chose to ignore the tone in her voice. So what are we going to do about him? We aren't going to do anything. If there are any questions to ask Simon, I'll be the one to ask them. With this, she turned on her heels and swept up the stairs. There was a touch of Joan of Arc on the way to the pyre about it. I know what you're thinking, I said once Peter and I were alone, and you're wrong. I'm not sure you do know what I'm thinking, Peter replied in that deep, comforting voice of his. You know your mother is positively amazing. Most parents have some difficulty accepting it when their children announce they're gay, let alone the prospect of accepting a same-sex spouse when he comes along. Jean not only offered you her full acceptance, she offered it to me too, and a place in her home. Why can't you do the same thing for her? It's not the same as you and me, I said, trying not to sound as defensive as I felt. It's that this guy popped up out of nowhere. We don't know anything about him. I'm worried about her. Peter came over to me and gently linked his fingers behind my neck. He searched my face with his beautiful green eyes. Do you remember how we met? Yeah, at Marco's birthday party. At Marco's birthday party, he repeated, then softly kissed me. I'd never clapped eyes on you before, but I was sitting there and you walked into the room, and it was love at first sight. He kissed me again. I pulled back slightly. Jesus, you don't think she's in love with him, do you? He dropped his head on my shoulder and laughed. You are a nut. I really am only worried about her. He lifted his head and faced me. I know. A Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.